Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, depending where you're connecting from. Let's get started and start talking about implementing passwordless. So I've called this passwordless part 1 because next week we will be talking about passwordless part 2. Now, before we start, a couple of logistical things to just make you aware of that. We are recording this session, and if it all goes well, we will probably upload this session to our YouTube channel where you'll all be able to review it if you want to. If you have any particular questions, there's a Q&A channel where you can post your questions. I have 2 colleagues on the call as well who are there to help you answer those questions. So hopefully you can get answers to the questions you have. And there's some interesting questions. We'll address them directly as well to make sure that we can provide you with as much information as we can get you. So what are we going to talk about today? So I have 2 sessions that I have organized. So one is for today. And so the agenda for today is really to talk about passwordless, what is involved, what is it, why do you want to use it, and then what's involved in using it in probably quite common scenarios that we see in small businesses, although a lot of these things apply to larger organizations as well. So I don't think it's purely limited to small businesses, but we want to be more practical rather than spend a lot of time about all the organizational things and the things you would do around projects, for example. Then next week, we want to talk about how you implement passwordless in what we call a hybrid environment. And to give you a little bit preview, what we mean by a hybrid environment is those scenarios where you have your Entra ID, your online platform, and you'll have your Active Directory, your on-prem platform, and you want to have your computers use both at the same time. That's what we call a hybrid join, and we'll be discussing that next week, what's involved in that, the potential use of group policies, etc. So next week is also a very technical session that is a more advanced scenario than what we're initially going to be talking about today. Now, a little preview when we talk about passwordless as well is it is actually a lot easier than you may think. So the first thing I want to just basically address why passwordless. Now, obviously, I think a lot of people have a lot of reasons why they won't want to do that. I'd like to give you a couple of good reasons that you can take to your management if you want to start justifying why you want to spend the money on it and why it is worthwhile doing this. And before you get worried about me giving you too many slides, I have several things in demos and things that I want to show you. So this is really not a whole presentation of slideware. So the first thing when we talk about passwords is, I call this one called passwords are terrible. Usually I like to use a 4-letter word to describe passwords, but we're in polite company, so I'm not going to do that today. But so when we talk about passwordless, what are the problems? Well, for example, people are not very original with their passwords. They reuse the same stuff all the time. And we actually see this happen as well. You can download from the internet a database. Nowadays, I think it's about 600 million passwords. And when we investigate, we find that that covers more than 80% of all passwords in use. So passwords, if you use the same password twice for the same application, you're actually, if one of those applications gets compromised, they may have the password for the other one as well. So it is not very safe. People are also really predictable. Just think about how many of you may use your birthday or your spouse's birthday, kid's birthday, etc. as the PIN number for your mobile phone and your credit card. Again, people are not very good at picking passwords. Passwords can be shared. This actually is quite an important one that I bring up here. Why? Because when we talk about passwordless and the proper password technologies, one of the key things that is important to understand there is that passwordless technologies, the ones that work well, and all the ones that we're going to be talking about today, you cannot really share the passkey or the passwordless authentication method. Whereas with a password, it's just a string. You can copy and paste it in text. You can copy and you can print it out if you want to. You can email it to people. And the problem with that is if you can do that, it can be stolen. And so when we're looking at security, we know that nowadays most compromises of companies involve, and probably more than 70% of the cases involves an identity compromise. And there, the most popular way of compromising an identity is phishing, which is nothing more than asking for a password. So the fact that you can actually give a password to somebody itself is a very big risk factor. Now, we see a lot of companies come up with all these complex password policies. It typically makes things worse. The recommendation from us, from Microsoft, is that you actually don't even have an expiration policy anymore. You want to have long passwords, and you want to encourage people to either have random passwords or passphrases if they use passwords. But really, if you can eliminate passwords, that's really what you want to do, because there's too many passwords. I have a password vault that I use for passwords, and I have, after 7 years, there's 400 passwords in there. And it gets quite absurd. I mean, you buy a toaster nowadays and you have to get a password. And I have a password for my microwave. And so, like, wow, they want me to create an account for my microwave, and I find it a little bit absurd. But so there's a lot of accounts we create, and the problem with each account is if any of these accounts are compromised and you're reusing the same password across different accounts, then in effect all these other accounts are also compromised. So passwords are not good. Now, if you want to talk to your management, or here I call these significant others, sometimes you just need to, if you want to enable things passwordless in your own accounts and you want to convince your family, for example, well, there's two very good arguments you can use. The first one is it's just a lot more secure. And we talk about orders of magnitude safer. I mean, we already basically stated many times before, if you've been to Microsoft events before, that MFA, for example, can eliminate 99% of password compromises. Now, if MFA has that kind of impact, then think about just doing away with passwords altogether, what the impact of that is. And it is really quite significant. The other one is, in anybody who has ever used Windows Hello, for example, on their Windows machine, can tell you it's also a much nicer user experience. I mean, Windows Hello for Business and Windows Hello, and I'll talk about both of them, is ultimately just, for many people, if you use like a Surface tablet, for example, you just log in by looking at your computer. And it is similar. My parents recently got new iPhones that have Face ID, and they love it because they just look at the phone and it logs them in. So it is a much better user experience, which will make you quite popular with your users as well when you start implementing these things. So just to make sure that we have some understanding when we talk about passwordless, really what we mean by passwordless is obviously we're doing authentication without using a password or a pre-shared secret. Now, a password is a pre-shared secret, but not every pre-shared secret is a password. We use pre-shared secrets still with site-to-site VPN tunnels, for example. And the moment you deal with things that are pre-shared between two parties, they can be compromised, they can be stolen. What we also really care about is that when we do authentication in a passwordless fashion, that anything we transmit is always unique every time we do it. And I'll explain how that actually works, but it really comes down to you want to make sure that if anything gets captured, it can't be reused, right? And so when we talked about phishing earlier, that phishing is a very big risk in your organization. While you want to be phishing resistant, you want to use passwordless. And not all passwordless methods are necessarily phishing resistant. They may make it harder, but even there, more and more technologies are being released. So when we talk about passwordless, we talk about authentication methods, and there's multiple authentication methods. And actually, I'm going to show them to you what they are and how you configure them, because there's multiple ways that you can use, and they're not used one to the exclusion of the other. So you can pick which one you like, and users can pick which ones they like, although some are a little bit harder to do. I mean, the oldest one that's out there is certificate-based authentication. That one's been out for over 20 years. We see that a lot in government and in military, for example. It has very specific requirements to deploy this, but it is passwordless. We have Windows Hello for Business. That's really a very nice way to do it. It's very quick and very easy for users. Users love it because they don't even need to type anything in. It's either fingerprint or biometric of some sort. We have FIDO2. And what are FIDO2 keys? Well, I have this USB thingy here, for example. This is a FIDO2 key, and effectively it's a device that I can use to do authentication. And we have the Microsoft Authenticator phone sign-in, for example. And you may see a pattern forming here. If you wonder what do all these methods have in common, is effectively, and then we have passkeys, that's the last one, and I'll go into detail what a passkey is. But except for the passkeys, and even there to a certain extent, all these methods have a link to hardware. So you have certificate-based authentication. Do smart card authentication, for example, you have a smart card. Windows Hello for Business, you're tied into the hardware, the computer that you're using. FIDO2 is basically the same thing, but using a USB stick to do it, for example. Microsoft Authenticator is tied into your mobile device. And then passkeys are sort of a little bit of both. Now, what are passkeys? And the reason I bring up passkeys is, well, we've been working, so all these password technologies, they're all open standards, they're public, they're shared, everybody can use them and implement them. But Microsoft is one of the driving forces behind that, but we're not the only ones. But we've been trying very hard to get companies like Apple to come on board, for example. And Apple has very specific requirements to make sure that when we do passwordless implementations, that they're easy to use. And so when we talk about FIDO2 keys, USB sticks, ultimately, when we talk about passkeys, that is actually a newer name for these FIDO2 keys. So that is, nowadays, these things, we're actually going to start calling them passkeys, but device-bound passkeys. So with passkeys, we have two different ways that you can use to sign in. And if you've been using passkeys on your iPhone, for example, or you can use passkeys, they're supported in Windows 11. So you can nowadays, for example, go in Google and you can sign in, set up a passkey, and that passkey is tied into Windows 11. You do passwordless sign into Gmail, for example. So these are all supported scenarios. I've seen passkeys used on eBay. I've seen them used on Adobe uses them, for example. And all these systems basically comes down to when you sign in, you just click a button, for example, or you type in a PIN number and you're actually signed in without having any password transmitted. But so the thing that I need to mention when we talk about passkeys, because this is important, is that there's actually two types of passkeys. So the first type of passkey, what we call as a single device passkey, and what we fit in this category typically is things like these USB keys, but also Windows Hello for Business. So where you have your passkey, where it is tied into the physical device you're using. So it could be your mobile phone, it could be your computer, it could be USB stick, etc. And so this is the more secure option. And this is basically what we've been calling FIDO2 keys for quite a while. They also exist as a software construct. So your Windows 10 machine can do Windows or FIDO2 sign in to supported systems, for example, using what we call WebAuth, which is the protocol behind it. But these keys are designed to be stored and bound to a single device, which basically means that you can't remove it from that device, you can't copy it, you can't share it. So it's very, very secure, which is why we all really loved it and we were all really pushed for it. Until then, you have some of the big consumer companies really said, we want it to be easier for users, because when you have a device-bound passkey, if the passkey is bound to a particular device, how do you sign into another device? And this is where then some of the new things come in. So there is a capability that you can still sign in through another device and then scan a QR code, and then it uses Bluetooth to exchange this type of information. You can sign in and then it registers a new one. And that's all very neat, but it is not good enough for some. And so we have a new evolution. This one is much newer because where the initial device-bound passkeys have been out for several, 5-6 years now at least. Multi-device passkeys is much, much newer. And what we have here is, rather than having the passkey bound to a particular device, they're bound to an account. And so they would live on the keychain that you have and get synchronized into the cloud. And then indeed, for example, and for Apple users amongst you, you would have the same passkey you would be able to use on your phone, your iPad, and your Mac, for example, and it would synchronize all that information across. And that's, of course, very useful. It's very user-friendly. It makes it very easy to sign into things. But there is one important thing to keep in mind here, is that when you synchronize passkeys to a cloud account, if that cloud account is compromised, then they can potentially use the passkeys to sign into services, which is why the single device passkeys are more secure. And so we expect to see those more into typical corporate type of environments. But then the multi-device passkeys, this is what I use every day in a lot of sites that I access nowadays, and I actually synchronize these through one password, which makes this available across different devices, different platforms, etc. So it's really quite nice. I quite like it. Now, because we were talking about all these authentication methods, I want to actually show you a little bit more where you will see that in an environment. So I'm going to switch to browser, and hopefully you can see this now. So this is a normal Entra tenant. So I've created a new one. This is basically brand new. There's nothing in there. I created this 2 days ago. As you can see, this is the free version of Entra ID. And the reason I picked the free version is because also I want to make sure that you understand that there is no licensing requirement to use passwordless in these environments. And if you go into the portal, so this is entra.microsoft.com, if you go under protection, you will find something called authentication methods. And when you go out of the box, actually not much is enabled. And so what are these authentication methods? These are basically how we're going to permit people to sign in to an account. And for example, FIDO2 security key, I would recommend you enable this, and you can enable this to all users. This does not enforce any of this thing. It just allows users to, if they want to use this, they can use it. So it doesn't really have any strong drawbacks. Although you can see there's usually most of these methods have some kind of additional options you can control around that. For example, you have this restrictions. You could, as a company, start whitelisting which FIDO2 keys, for example, are going to be supported. But that's not something that you have to do. The other one that you very much want to enable is the Microsoft Authenticator. So the Microsoft Authenticator is an app that is installed on mobile devices, and you can configure this to do things such as passwordless sign-in. And you have the option as well. For example, if you look at the options, you see several. Basically, it says Microsoft Managed basically means that you're currently following the defaults that we suggest, but you can change these things as well. So one of the things here that is useful to point out as well is you can use, for example, enforce to show the application name in the authenticator when you get an authentication push, and provide geographic location as well. Now, keep in mind that geographic location here is based on the IP address where you're coming from, and especially with mobile devices, and depending where you are, that's not necessarily always that reliable. Now, I'm based in Australia right now, and a lot of these geographic locations put me in the wrong city, almost 1,000 kilometers from where I actually am. So that's not something that we control. That comes down to your provider. Now, another one that you want to enable is the temporary access pass, and I'll show you how you can use a temporary access pass, because a temporary access pass is very useful for passwordless scenarios. If you want to go in an environment where you can get users use your login without actually ever knowing a password. And now, what do you use a temporary access pass? Well, as I explained earlier as well, a lot of the passwordless methods are tied into some piece of hardware, typically your PC, your mobile phone, etc. And so you have that initial enrollment, you need some kind of secret, some kind of password. And so the temporary access password is basically that. It is a potentially one-use password, or a password that you can use only for example, 1 hour, that you can do to do this initial step the first time, something you would do the first time when somebody joins your company, for example, that you then can use to enroll everything. Now, hardware auth and software auth tokens, in case you wonder what that is, these are basically your one-time passwords that can be created by password applications. So if I enable, for example, software auth tokens, now you will be able to use something like a Google Authenticator to generate a code. This is not a passwordless method. So these methods are used as a multi-factor authentication one. They're not used as a passwordless method. Certificate-based authentication is passwordless. Now, I can spend half an hour talking just about certificate-based authentication. It is very much an enterprise type of scenario. I suspect that in smaller companies, you're probably not going to be bothering with this, because it requires a PKI environment, and that is usually quite difficult to set up. So with that, let's go back to our presentation, and You can all admire my face is very big. And now there's a couple of things that I do want to make clear just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So when we talk about the environments and the way you can set this up, we have something what we call a cloud-only environment. A cloud-only environment is basically if you just have Entra ID. For example, you have an M365 subscription, and or you just have an Azure subscription, for example, and you just have Entra. We see this is certainly something that is growing. So we have more and more companies that go into this space, but we would see still 80% of all our customers are what we call a hybrid environment. So they have an on-prem Active Directory deployment that they synchronize with Entra ID. And so the reason I point this out is a cloud-only environment and hybrid environment, they do have some different requirements and different things you're going to be doing, but you have also the options may not be entirely what you expect them to be, because here we're talking about the environment itself. And so a hybrid environment, for example, Microsoft is still very much a hybrid environment. We're a very large environment, but we then also have actually the relationship from your computers to the environment, where you have what we call an Entra ID join and a hybrid join. And so in Microsoft, to put it in perspective, we're a hybrid environment, but we use Entra ID join. And so Entra ID join is where you take your Windows machines and you join them to Entra ID, but you don't join them to a traditional Active Directory. So this is the simplest way of implementing passwordless, because if you just have the free tenant that I just showed you and you take a PC and you join it to that tenant, it'll actually be passwordless enabled. So Windows Hello for Business will be registered, you'll be able to use it. Now, Entra ID join as well, compared to hybrid join, is also a bit more secure because the PCs are much more independent from each other. And so lateral moves from one PC to another are harder to accomplish, a lot harder to accomplish. Now, in a traditional Active Directory environment, you can put a lot of things in place to limit that, but it is, and it is very possible to do that, but it requires more work. So the thing to keep in mind here is that an Entra ID join that you do, that's the method we recommend. This is how nowadays 99.9% of people in Microsoft use their computers, so they're not joined to any traditional Active Directory anymore. And this works with both cloud-only environments and hybrid environments. On the other hand, a hybrid join, there your computer is joined both to Entra ID and on-prem Active Directory, and that requires a hybrid environment. So that is what we're going to be talking about next week, what is involved in implementing that. It's quite an interesting scenario and quite a lot of fun. Now, another thing that I do want to point out as well that is important is when we talk about Windows Hello. And Windows Hello is a convenience feature. It's been there quite a long time. If you think it looks a lot like Face ID on iPhones, for example, it's because it's essentially the same technology. It was initially developed for Windows by the people who also built the Kinect, and then Apple brought that on board. But we also have the counterpart to that is Windows Hello for Business. And Windows Hello for Business is not a convenience feature. This is very much a security feature. So Windows Hello for Business is what happens. Well, I mean, when you look at the two, the user experience is identical. So the user doesn't notice it. But when you join a Windows machine to Entra ID, not registered, just joining, then you can sign into that PC using an Entra ID credential. And so we call that Windows Hello for Business because it is a registration where your PC actually establishes a relationship into Entra ID. And you sign in. When you log in, you're actually having an online login to the Entra ID infrastructure, and you get single sign-on to all your applications as well. And so this is very strong from a security point of view. It's a lovely user experience, and it is a very strong security feature as well. So a couple of practical things that I want to go through as well is what's involved in this. So there's three different scenarios that you need to keep in mind. The first one is what I call an Entra ID join on a very basic scenario. So if you have an Entra ID tenant, if you join a machine to that tenant, you'll get passwordless. Now, if you have Intune in your environment, then you will have to have Intune configured to use Windows Hello for Business and to configure the passwordless configuration. So Intune gives you the option of configuring what it looks like, but by itself it's not a requirement. And then we have the last scenario is the hybrid join, where actually you need to have a relationship set up with Entra ID and on-prem Active Directory. And to make that work against on-prem Active Directory involves a lot more steps. You need to set up things like Cloud Trust, you need to set up group policy, etc. And we'll be addressing that next week. Now, the bits you need, you need Entra ID in your environment. That works with any of the versions, so there's no licensing requirements for that. But, and this is the key thing, Entra ID will do passwordless for all the applications that rely on Entra ID for the authentication. So you need to make sure that you migrate your applications to use Entra ID. So if you have ADFS in your environment, you need to transition those applications across from ADFS to Entra ID. Similarly, if you want to sign in on a Windows machine, you need to join that machine to Entra ID. Do you need Intune? You do not need Intune, but if you have Intune, you can use Intune to create rules and create configuration around it. Do you need Active Directory on-prem? You do not. So you can do all this without on-prem Active Directory, but if you have Active Directory, then you want to make sure that your domain controls are running 2016. Now, there are ways of running it with older versions of Windows Server as well for your domain controllers. We don't care about the other servers, but it requires a PKI environment, and that gets really, really quite complex. 2016 is already 8 years ago when that came out. So if you're still running 2016, it's a good idea to start thinking about even if you're running 2016, you want to upgrade it as well. Is there specific hardware you need? Well, the two main types of hardware we have are TPMs, which is a chip on your typical business computers will have this. Is it required? No. Is it recommended? Very strongly. And again, this is where then Intune comes in. Through Intune, you can tie this into a TPM chip, which makes it impossible to remove the key, the credentials from the computer itself. FIDO2 keys are very similar to a TPM chip, but it is on a USB stick rather than something else. And the last thing you need is you need Windows 10 and Windows 11 if you want to be able to sign in directly to the machine using an Entra ID account. Can we do this with other platforms? Well, right now the problem is that, for example, on Mac OS and iOS, etc., that Apple does not support logging in with anything other than a PIN code or a password when you start up the device from a cold boot effectively. So we can do things like unlocking it on Mac OS, but we can't do that after boot up because Apple doesn't support that at this point. Good. What you need to do, you need to enable passwordless. If you have an Entra ID tenant, it is enabled out of the box, so that's easy. The next one that you need to do is if you want to have people sign in to Windows computers, they need to join those machines to Entra ID. So that can take a little bit more. And then the last thing, and this is the one that takes the most time, is you need to move your applications into Entra ID. So that is, in a sense, the biggest thing. And so here is the first big message you need to remember, that by itself, actually enabling passwordless is very easy because you don't really need to do much to enable it. But it is also not a one-size-fits-all. It's not something you turn on and suddenly everything is passwordless. I mean, when I joined Microsoft 4 years ago, we were at about 80% of all the applications were at that point supporting passwordless because they were all moved to Entra ID. Nowadays, we're closer to 95, 96%, something like that. So this is for a lot of organizations. If you have a lot of applications, may take a bit of time. So when we say how long does all this take? Well, the first thing, enabling it very, very quick. Moving applications, depending on how many you have, this could take quite a long time. So we see large enterprises that take years to do this. Smaller companies, if you have 20 applications, you're done in a month, right? So this is, you want to make sure that your applications are relying on Entra ID for authentication. If they do that, they'll be able to work passwordless. In terms of your Windows machines, you need to join them to Entra ID. Again, this is easy to do with new machines you take out of the box. If you have just an Entra ID join, it's actually quite easy. People can do it at home because you just need internet connectivity, and you could then configure the machines using something like Intune if you want to. Right? But if you have hybrid joins, etc., there's a lot more work involved. And so we see a lot of organizations do this when they do device refreshes, for example, say, okay, we're going to swap out your machine for a new one. And at that time, they basically move it to a machine that is then Entra ID joined and fully passwordless for that user. So there is multiple different steps. There's multiple ways you can go about this. Now, the last thing I want to talk about before we get to a bigger demo is just I want to touch a little bit upon how all these passwordless methods work, because it's going to help you understand where the security comes in. And here we're actually using something that is actually very old and has been around for a very long time. It's public and private keys. I'm going to say old. This was in the first public standard of this came out in 1977. So we're talking about almost 50 years ago. And the thing what you have here is we have what we call a private key. The private key typically is just nowadays 2048 random ones and zeros that get generated typically when we talk about the FIDO2 keys, when we talk about TPMs, etc., or mobile phones as secure enclave. You have a piece of hardware that generates this key. So this is on your device, and the private key is generated for each application where you set up a relationship to do passwordless signing. Now, if you're using Entra ID, you will be creating that for your relationship with Entra ID. So this is generated when you actually register a computer. Now, that private key can be used to create a public key. And this is just something we use some complex math to create a public key. The public key is a bit smaller, so we can recreate the public key as many times as we want from a private key, but we can't do the opposite. So we can't create the private key from the public key. So this is, and they're tied in, they have a one-to-one relationship. So you can't, it's always the same public key that comes out of it. And these keys have a very interesting relationship because what I encrypt with one key, I decrypt with the other. And the opposite is true as well. What I encrypt with the public key, I can read with the private key. Now, when you think about it, you can use this, and public keys, the idea is public, you can share it with everybody. And in this, we don't actually necessarily do that, but we can. So the public key is not secure in that sense, whereas a private key, which we store on these dedicated hardware in most cases, needs to be very, very well protected. Now, if you have that behavior, if I can encrypt something with one key and I cannot read it with the same key, I need to use the opposite key to read it. What do I use this for? Well, you have encrypting with a public key, you can use it to send encrypted data to somebody else. This gets used all the time when you actually set up secure sessions to websites. So in a sense, you use this hundreds of times a day, but you don't know it. The other one, if I encrypt something with the private key, anybody with the public key can read it. So I'm not protecting the data. So what is the purpose of that? Well, the purpose there is proving possession of that key. And think of it in the same equivalent. I have a house key for my house. And so because I have the key, I can get into my house. If you don't have the key, you can't get in. So I have to protect the key, because if my key is stolen, then people can get into my house. This is a bit the same concept here, but we do it in a digital fashion. So we use the private key to do things like authentication and to sign documents. So when we talk about digital signatures, for example, is based around private keys. We use private keys to sign things. Again, this gets used a lot, but you usually don't see it. But so how does this work in an authentication context? Well, I have my private key, my public key. Say I join my machine to Entra ID. It is basically when I join the machine, during the registration, the private key is shared with Entra ID, and Entra ID will store that private key for that particular device that I'm registering it, that I'm joining. It will store that private key so that it can set that up. Now, this is, I mentioned earlier, say, for example, I can register a passwordless credential for my Windows Hello, but I could have multiple computers, so they each will have their own key. I could have different methods set up. I use a FIDO2. This could be a separate key. So you can have a whole bunch of public keys associated with a single user account. So you're not limited to one. It's just When you join it, that will be created. And so what happens when we want to authenticate and sign in? Well, Entra ID will generate what we call a nonce. And a nonce is just a bit of nonsensical data. It's just random letters and numbers. They don't mean anything. But it sends that to your client, and your computer, your Windows machine, when you're doing the authentication, will take this and will encrypt this with the private key. And so we get a new bit of random data almost. Well, it's not random, it's the encrypted version of the nonce that we received. We send that back, and now Entra ID is going to read and decrypt it with the public key that it has. Now, if it's successfully encrypted and both have the same value, then your authentication is successful. Now, this technique is used by passkeys, it's used by FIDO2, Windows for Local Business. This certificate-based authentication works the same way. So this is a very, very common technique. And with that, I want to move to my demos. But before I go to the demos, I have a potential small, well, this is not a favor, this is an offer. So the team I belong to, we are part of engineering, and we interested especially in the smaller segment of the industry. So we look after smaller companies, not your big enterprise companies. We have other people doing that. And we very much want to talk to smaller companies to get feedback and get your input on what works well and what doesn't work well with our products. So if you scan that, if you are interested in talking to us and giving us a piece of your mind and telling us everything you hate and everything you don't hate, you want to tell us these things, scan that QR code and register for it. And in the next couple of weeks, we'll get in touch and we'll set up a conversation where we can actually discuss what you think we should be doing with our products, for example. We want to listen to the smaller companies, etc. So this is, if you're interested in participating, this is your option, your opportunity to do so. And with that, let's go back to the demos. So I showed you before how I set up here these authentication methods, and now we're going to do something else. Let's go and create a user, and I want to actually show you. So as I said, this is a completely empty environment. So we'll create a new user, and we'll call this new user, oh, well, let's go a very original name and call this user John. Right, and we give this name, the user needs to have a name, John Demo. As you can see here, I have, besides creating a user account, I'm really not doing anything else. Now, there is something I really want to show you because I think it is quite cool. I want to show you how you can use a user account and start doing things without actually ever knowing the password of that user. And so as you can see now, you can, hold on, you see user John here. I mean, this user account has a password, but I don't know what the password is, right? And I'm gonna do a couple of things here. So you have a mobile device and I have the Microsoft Authenticator. And so the first thing I was talking about what we call a temporary access pass. And so I'm going to look at this user account here, and I'm actually going to create a temporary access pass. And so the temporary access pass, I can just go, we call that an authentication method. So you can see you have some other things, but these ones only get used for multi-factor authentication. But a temporary access pass is an authentication method that we actually consider multi-factor out of the box. So this one is going to be valid for 1 hour. I'm going to add that one here. And you're going to see that this is has generated me a password. And so what I'm going to do now is actually I go into this application, go to the authenticator, and the authenticator, this is pretty much what it looks like when you log in, and I'm going to add an account. And this is a work or school account, and basically I'm going to sign in. And so the first thing I have to do, my user was called John, right? So we have John at, this is hopefully in most other environments, you'll have a little bit easier domain name we use, but this is basically purely for a demo, so this should work. And you see now it's asking me for temporary access pass because it already knows that I've enabled this on this account. So I do K23, JD, let's just make sure I can see this. So this is the kind of scenario where you say, for example, you have a new employee joins your company, you create this on their first day, you create this temporary access pass. and you share that to them. The manager shares that temporary access pass with them, and basically now we have the account set up. And you can see here we have a whole registration. So this phone is set up to sign in, and I can now also request to do the phone sign in. All right, I think this is a typical Microsoft tradition. We demonstrate stuff and then things don't go exactly the way we want them to. So I have to make sure that I enable this one. I want to be able to use the Microsoft Authenticator setting. And I'm actually going to do the registration again. Let's go to my authentication method. Temporary access pass. I haven't written it down, so let's create a new one. So let's bring this one back up. So to give you an idea of what actually I'm doing now is, so I have this one set up and I want to enable what we call phone sign in. So normally if I had this enabled from the start, I wouldn't have to do this. It does it for me. But so now it's going to ask me for another prompt. We're going to set that up because what this is going to do, it's actually going to register this device as an authenticator with the account. Now, an important piece of information here to share with your users as well is when you do that, is that we don't, while you register the device, you don't get any control or visibility into that device beyond the fact that it is, for example, a iOS device. Do I get this right? Hopefully, if this works. Actually, I need to press on my phone. And re-register the device. And this actually will set up my phone as a secure device. And hopefully it'll be friendly and actually complete everything properly. And so what you have here as well, and then I'll show you how that works when you actually want to use that. Certainly taking a sweet time to complete. But so normally what would happen once this is done is when I go to, yep, this actually has completed. If I go to devices for this user, you can see that this phone now shows up and it's a registered device. And the only information we know about this phone is basically that it's iOS and 7.2. That's all we know. I can delete this and I can disable this as an authentication system, but I have no visibility into what this phone is actually used for example. So if users are concerned, then they shouldn't be too worried about this. Now, you can see as well now, basically, that this has slightly changed. Now it says disable phone sign in, but I don't have to do that. So I did all these things without ever knowing what the password is that I used for this user. And now you can go a lot further with this kind of stuff. For example, here I have, and let's move this one to the side a bit, a Windows machine that is going for the out-of-box experience. And so this is when you start up, you're taking it out of the box and you said, okay, well, I'm going to set this one up for work. So you select this one. And again, now I have to sign in. I'm going to sign in here. And I have the, I don't actually want to use the temporary access pass. So I'm just going to, it's going to give me an error. Actually, I don't have the password. Normally sign-in options. There you go. Face fingerprint security key, the passkey. That's not what I wanted to have you do. You still have the pass. I mean, I can do the same thing here with the temporary access pass. Interesting. I thought I had this. I don't think there's a problem. Let me make sure we have the right users. Okay. So I can do the same thing here, but normally I think it is still replicating something in the background. Because you should only have to do this once. And then is incorrect. Oh, other ways to sign in. Okay, good. That's what I wanted to see. Let's get my mobile phone back up here, because this one is way more interesting. Okay. And we go back to Authenticator. So I'm basically going to say I'm going to use the Authenticator to sign in. And this basically goes, oh, request wasn't sent. Oh, that's not what I want to see. Because I don't know the password for this one. Oh, as I said, the best laid plans go to fail when you do demos, isn't it? I run this demo multiple times, and it was being very cooperative. Because normally it's possible that I have a little bit of a network problem, but there you go. It's registering this device. So in this case, I use the temporary access pass. So you have a couple of different options. But the thing what I actually want to show you here, so this device is being joined to Entra ID because I selected to join this and use this for work purposes. And so now it's going to be setting up things on that device. And what normally is going to happen is when I was looking at the user here, when you go to devices, at some point you will see this Windows device. See, there you go. The Windows device is showed up as well. It's an Entra joined device. Now, in this environment, I don't have any Intune in the environment, so I cannot enforce any rules around it, but passwordless is going to be enabled. And so the thing what I have here, so now it's done its initial stuff. So this is where the screen had changed. Now, if you have Windows Hello with biometrics, this is the point where it's going to ask you to register biometrics. In this case, because I don't have biometrics in this virtual machine, I am just going to use this a PIN number. Sure, I find the right PIN number. And I can use the PIN number to log in. So now it's going to, and so the thing that I want to show you is I'm going to sign out. And so I have a machine here where I basically run this by joining it to Entra ID. I never typed in a password. So now if I have a biometric, for example, I log in and I'm logged into this machine. And I will show you even that single sign is working as well. So we open up a browser and let's just open up a site that would be protected. And the only one I can think is actually the standard Azure portal. Now, this user doesn't have any access to anything, but the portal itself, you can see now it tries to authenticate. And now this user is actually logged in to the portal. And you can see it has no access to anything, but you can see the name here, etc. So this is single sign-on a machine, out of the box, registered without ever typing a password. Now, there's a couple of other things that I wanted to show because we need to be cognizant of time as well. When you have Intune in your environment, then you do need to have some configurations done for Intune as well. And so there's two options, or actually multiple things you can do. You can go under Windows and go for the enrollment settings. And if you go under Windows Enrollment, you see there's Windows Hello for Business. Now, this is going to be settings that are applying only when you enroll a machine. And you can see here, for example, allows you to enable Windows Hello for Business. And you typically need to set that, and you can set certain rules around the PIN numbers, etc., and whether you're going to permit biometrics, etc., or not. Now, the same thing can be done using configuration policies. So I have a particular policy here. If you're looking at what is available in the policy, you can see, again, you have the same type of settings. So the configuration profiles is what you would use to push this out to existing computers and making sure it's enforced, where the enrollment one is what you use during enrollment. So typically you would set up both. Now, the last thing I want to show, since I now I'm here, I'm signed in with a particular user account. And if I go to my account, so where are all these things configured for users and what they can do? So I'm signed in here. Obviously, this is just a normal user account. I can go to security update. And I can say, for example, if I want to register a FIDO2 key, for example, say, for example, I want to change the different methods I have available. You can see this account has Microsoft Authenticator set up. I've also actually on this particular one set up to use the Authenticator app. But say, for example, I want to, and you can do multiple of these things, right? So like I want to use a security key. And what happens now? So I have this security key here. Actually, I'm going to plug that in to a USB port on this machine. And then I can actually set this up to register this particular key. And so now we have the same process is happening. This is an authentication challenge that comes to my normal authenticator, so you can't see this one, but this is because I am changing some authentication settings on the account. So that's a normal behavior you would see. So this is a passwordless sign-in. I did there with phone sign-in as well. I can stay signed in. I don't particularly care about that kind of stuff, but I'm going to register a security key, for example. And so users can do this. So say, look, this is a USB device. It's plugged in. It's you should have some stuff pop up very soon. I'll have to. No, this is not the one I want to use. You type in a PIN number. I touch this key, and so now we're actually setting things up, and it's going to generate keys. So in this process, I call this my UB key. In this process, effectively, my USB stick generated the keys, registered them with Entra ID, so it shows up here, and now I can use this USB key to sign into this website in a complete passwordless fashion. So we have a couple of minutes left. Let's see if there's any particular questions that we need to address. Jay, is there any specific questions? Oh, no. Okay, that's good.
Yeah, there's nothing that has come up.
Okay, very good. Well, thank you very much for attending. I hope this was interesting. And we can wrap up here. Thank you very much.